Welcome back to the All Turtles podcast, a show about the future of work, the future of health, and entrepreneurs building the future. I'm John C. Fuentes, co-founder of All Turtles. Today, I'm interviewing Sho Kuwamoto, the director of product at Figma. He's here to talk about how Figma is allowing for real-time collaboration even when everyone's working remotely, and why that's more important now than ever. So we're joined today by Sho Kuwamoto, who's the director of product at Figma. And we've talked about Figma a couple of times on this podcast. We're huge fans of it. I know Phil has gone on and on about Figma. But Sho, for anyone who might not be familiar, can you give us an explanation of what Figma does?
Sure. So Figma is a design tool for people who want to create user interfaces. And so those user interfaces could be a mobile app or a website. And it's not just for the designers, but it's also for anybody who wants to be part of that process. And so it's for stakeholders who maybe care about the design and want to give input. It's for developers who maybe need to build out the design. And it's all hosted online. So in the same way as Google Docs is like the online version of Microsoft Word, Figma is like the online version of a number of other design tools.
Sure, yeah. So what are you responsible for as the director of product? What falls under your...
We divide up Figma into sort of a couple of large buckets. And the bucket that I focus on is the editor itself. So basically everything that happens after you click on a file, that's sort of my domain. And then I have a number of other people that I work with in there, and we all sort of collaborate on that area.
Cool. And the company is relatively young, right? It's been around a handful of years?
Yeah, I actually don't know how old the company itself is. I've been there for 5 years. So,
wow.
And when I joined, it was before the product had launched. So it was sort of in stealth mode. But the product had been in development for a number of years before that. So maybe 2 years before that. So it's been around for a little while.
Yeah. We talked about this a bit earlier prior to the show, but we have a lot of product designers and engineers in the podcast audience.
Great.
You have a really interesting career path, and especially with your education background. Could you just talk a little bit more about your background?
I went to school normally up until 6th grade, and then I skipped a bunch of grades. So I went to high school for a year after that, and then I went straight to college. So I went to Caltech when I was 13. And I studied physics, and I graduated when I was 18, and then I went off to Purdue for a PhD, and then halfway through my PhD, I decided that I wanted to shift from physics to computers. So it's a high-level overview.
Wow, I have a close friend who has an extremely similar background.
Oh, really?
Really interesting, yeah. But we've had PhDs come on our podcast before and talk about how their doctorate has been useful in some way, or completely starkly different, or and it's always been kind of an interesting journey about how they got to the tech world. So how does a PhD in physics come into play with the work you do now, if it does at all?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know for sure that it does. But, definitely going to school, for more formal kind of education like that gives you a certain way of thinking about problems. I remember there was a professor I had, this is in undergrad, not in grad school, but he had a habit of picking on students who would fall asleep in class, and he would, if they'd fall asleep, he literally would throw chalk at them, which I don't know if that's, a good thing, but he would throw chalk at them to wake them up. And then he would ask them a question about the material that they missed. Uh-huh. And, of course they wouldn't know the answer. And then what he would say is, well, if you don't know the answer is always 0, 1, infinity, or you can't tell based on the premise, right? And, it sounds kind of silly, but it actually is. I think about that sometimes because, in business or product design or whatever, you're always faced with these situations where you don't know the answer, right? You always have to make a decision before you have all the information. And, the answer is always going to be 0, 1, infinity, or you can't tell, or whatever. Sure, yeah. I mean, the equivalent of that, right? Which is to say there are only a couple of answers that are going to make sense. And you have to just sort of figure out based on your gut and based on the information that you have, which of these answers is it, right? And so just to bring it back to Figma for a second, when I joined Figma, the product hadn't even been released yet, and it was in sort of demo form. So it wasn't, it didn't look like a shipping product, but I just took a look at it, and it was so fast and so stable and had so many of the nuances right that I just thought about it, and I was like, well, somebody is going to figure this out. Somebody is going to
Right.
figure out how to get design tools onto the web, because I just looked at this thing and it's obviously possible. I mean, this isn't there yet, but it's obviously possible. And if it is possible, then almost certainly it's going to be something that people gravitate towards, right? Because design is like, I think of design as like a communication act. It's something that you're doing to explain your thoughts to somebody else, or to figure something out and put it down and work with other people on it and stuff. And all of that communication stuff happens so much better when you're online. And so just looking at it, I thought, well, this obviously is going to work. Like, somebody's going to figure this out. So maybe this company will do it. I don't know, but let's try. And so in the same way that like this 0-1 infinity kind of thinking, was sort of drilled into us in school, it was like, how do you take the information that you have and make a really, really good educated guess? I think that's maybe the part that I use the most in my job.
Oh, that's fascinating. And just as a personal anecdote, for when I first discovered Figma, I think had probably a less crystallized but similar feeling just from a consumer point of view. It's just like, wow, this is something. Like, this works.
Right.
This is going to be huge. And actually, let's talk about Figma, like the company and maybe even the current climate, the current atomized workforce that everyone is right now stuck at home. Has there been some observable change in behavior for Figma users over the last 2 months now, 2.5 months? Has there been a spike in users? Is there like a set of features that's you're discovering is being used in a different way, or anything like that?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, first off, there's definitely a noticeable increase in usage. It's not like I heard some stats about Zoom, and Zoom is just like crazy.
Right.
It's not crazy like that, but definitely if you look at the graphs, you can see like this is when everybody started staying home, and you can see the usage go up. And what I'm finding interesting is the features that people ask for, or that they talk about. Like, there's a lot of sort of chatter on Twitter about Figma that I sort of pay attention to.
Right.
It's not the things that you would think, because I think if you think about collaboration, you would think, oh, it's probably like commenting. Like, people are going to ask about, like, can I have better notifications for my comments or something like that. But I think what people gravitate towards more is features around presence, if that makes sense. So you'll be in a Figma file, and the only way you can collaborate with another designer right now, or if you're an engineer and you're collaborating with a designer or what have you, is electronically, right? Because before you would just go to their desk and you'd say, hey, can we talk about this thing? And you can't do that anymore. And I think people are finding that a space like Figma allows them to sort of, work with each other in more of this collaborative way. It's sort of like looking over somebody's shoulder and talking, and sort of, if they're sort of doing something that's a little off from what you were saying, you might draw something directly on the screen to show them what you meant, and so on. And so people ask for even like really, really odd features. Like, they say things like, I really want to be able to wiggle my cursor and have people like notice that I'm here. And then like, or somebody asked for a feature that they called booping. They said, I want to be able to boop somebody's cursor and give them a high five, And so those might seem frivolous or silly, but I think what it is that, being remote and being digitally connected, I think people sort of miss some of the nuance of what it feels like to work together. And when you're in a space like a Figma document, it feels a little bit more like you're in the same place. Yeah. And I think people are craving even more of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at All Turtles, we have a number of projects that touches on that very sentiment. Oh, there's a new product, or it seems like it. I saw an announcement. What's Figma for Education?
Oh, it's not a new product per se. I think it's we're just rethinking how we price our offerings for education.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, before
a new channel. Yeah,
exactly. Well, I mean, we've always had a free version for education, and before it was pretty restricted. We had like a list of domains that was, that came from a company that knows how to do this, and if you weren't from one of those domains, you couldn't have access to the program. And we just extended it to a much broader set of users. So, for example, if you're in a boot camp, or if you are, so there's a number of different ways that people learn now. And so we're just expanding it to be a much, much wider group of people who can participate.
Cool. Can we bring it back to like the design process a bit? And maybe even some of this Twitter listening is really interesting. I mean, for the community of users that you have, designers, engineers, I imagine these people have some strong opinions with what makes good design, with what's a good feature. Where does the impetus for building something new come in? Does it start with user research? Does it start with, listening to this chatter online and saying, hey, that sounds like a good idea, and just kind of running with it? Or is there like a process? Is there a rubric you guys follow?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've actually been meaning to write this up, but it's sort of like a formal part of it, and there's an informal part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And the formal part is basically on a quarterly basis, we take our teams and we go through this exercise of really trying to understand what is it we're trying to do with this team? What do we think the biggest opportunities are? And then we try to crystallize that into a narrative. So we say, it's not just sort of like a stack ranked list of features, but we try to say, well, if we're successful with our prototyping features, for example, then the world looks like this. People use us for these kinds of things, and these kinds of people now can be successful, and so on. And then we try to connect that to some sort of business story. So we say, and if this happens, then more people will blank or whatever. So that's sort of the formal part. And, we get the entire company involved. We get input from, the sales team and support. And we, each of the product teams, including engineering and design and, marketing and research, they all sort of get together and participate in this process. So that's sort of the formal sort of structure. But I would say the informal part is, at the end of the day, you have to really guess as to what to build, right? Like what's going to have the biggest impact. And not only do you have to guess what to build, you have to guess how much effort do we put in trying to do something new here. And so, for certain features, you really just don't want to spend any time trying to do something new. Like, people say, hey, it really bugs me that the permissions on my prototypes are like this, and so I can't share them this way or whatever. You just sort of try to understand the thing as fast as possible and just build it, right?
Yeah.
And then there's other things like we released this feature called Smart Selection about a year ago. And the idea of Smart Selection is that when you're doing a design, a lot of times you'll find that objects are placed in a regular pattern. So you'll have things that are like 10 pixels apart. And a human being can look at that and say, well, that obviously is a list of things that are 10 pixels apart. And I would love to sort of, be able to sort of squish them together or reorder them or whatever. And, why can't computers know that those objects are in a list and, give you the power to be able to do that? And so that was a more out there idea. And so that took a little while to figure out how do we do this in a way that feels natural, that doesn't require you to specify upfront, hey, the stuff inside this box is a list or whatever, but we thought the investment was worth it because it's just a pattern that we see a lot in people's work. And we thought that if we could make the tool smart enough to be able to help you with that it would really resonate. And so we did that. I love the feature. Our customers seem to love the feature too. And that's the kind of thing where you just have to have this gut for, this feels like something that's worth investing in, even when we didn't exactly know what the solution was going to be.
Yeah, my next question, I'm just kind of glowing. It's, the product, from the onboarding experience, from someone who's not a designer, and I have a Figma account because we make a bunch of products and it's nice to be able to see them in process. It's just such a cohesive product that allows for so much customization, and you can do so much with it. Like, it's such a multifunctional tool. I have two questions. One is, how do you maintain the thing as so cohesive and still so focused and still directed at such a specific audience when it allows for so much to do? Like, there's just so many features, but still feels cohesive. And then I guess another question is, what's been a really surprising use case? Apart from the booping or the wiggling of the cursors, has anything come out like in a customer story or in a team internally that people are just like randomly using Figma for something that was a total unintentional consequence?
Like every company, when you're in the company and you see the sausage being made, it doesn't look quite so cohesive. Like we look at the product and we're like, oh man, I can't believe we did this, and then this thing is totally not the same as this, and, So, but I appreciate that we got it enough right that it feels okay. It's really interesting working on a product that is as broad as Figma. So I would say, most of the products that our customers design, that our customers use Figma for, tend to be ones where there's a more narrow path that they expect their users to go down, right? So you might have a mobile app and there's like 3 or 4 or 5 things you want to guide people to be able to do. And you just, the whole goal is to make it as obvious and efficient as possible for them to do those 5 things. And with Figma, it's a little bit the opposite, where there's like 200 features and you just never know, like, one day somebody might come into the tool and they use, feature 1, feature 35 and feature 68 or whatever. And they all have to sort of work together as you point out. And so it can be a little challenging to figure this out. And so I think what we try to do is we try to break things down into as atomic pieces as possible, if that makes sense.
Sure.
And we try to figure out how we can sort of make principles for those things that allow us to think about it. So as an example, I'll give two examples. So there's components and styles are two features that Figma has that allow for reuse. And components are objects that you draw that you then duplicate, and then when you change the master, the duplicates will also change. So the classic uses for this would be things like you create a button and then everybody in the company uses that button. If later you change something about the button, like you change the corner radius, then everybody will see that corner radius change. And another similar feature is styles. And styles are properties that you apply to an object. So for example, it could be like a text style, like a heading style or a body style, but styles can also be used for things like colors and things like that. So for both of these features, there's some principles that we came up with for how they work that are just pretty deep and fundamental to how we think about them and how we write the code for them. So for components, it's things like components can have other components inside them, and any property of a component can be overridden by somebody who's using that component, except for a few that we think are dangerous or are going to be confusing, etc. And then for styles, we had sort of a different way of thinking about it, which is like components are like one thing. There's not like 5 different kinds of components for button components versus like dialog box components or whatever, right? So components are just one mechanism. Whereas for styles, we decided to break it up into lots of small different styles. So you can have a color style, or you can have a text style, or you can have a like an effect style. And the reason we did that was because we looked at how people were using styles in the wild. And what they would do is they would have to take these combinations of styles and make a separate style for each combination. So for example, for text, they might say, here's my style for a headline that's to the left. And here's my style for a headline that's to the right. And here's my style for a headline that's centered. And by the way, here's my style for the headline that's to the left, but is green. And here's my style for the headline that's, and if you take the combination of those things, you end up with like literally people would have like 200, 300 text styles to manage all the combinations of them. And so, looking at that, we decided to break it up into these smaller things. And then there's this question of, well, if you don't have any rules for how you're going to break it up, then it's sort of like Wild West, and how are you going to make this work or whatever. So we came up with rules for how to break it up, and and I could get into that, but the point is that we looked at how people were using it. We came up with principles for how we wanted to construct the feature, and then those principles I think help us figure out how to put those features back together into something that people can then plug in and play around with in different ways, and have the whole system still make sense.
That makes sense to me. I see like a big spreadsheet with just way more than 2 vectors, like a third dimension and a fourth dimension of,
yep, exactly.
of categories of things. Wow, that's really cool. And then my other question was, what's like a weird thing people are using Figma for that you just had no idea that's what they do? Right.
Well, first of all, like I'm just so thankful that people are using Figma at the rate that they're using it, because I'm sure you've had a lot of people on your podcast, or you have people in your friends network, and no matter how good your idea is, and no matter how good your execution is, you can make something, and it's still like a crapshoot as to whether people will resonate with that thing and find it interesting, right? So we built this thing, and people are using it for all sorts of things, which like I still pinch myself that like so many people are using it. But in terms of the what they use it for, it is kind of what we expected them to use it for the most part, except for some of these more out there use cases. So people use it to design applications, right? And then people use it to visually communicate more broadly. So they'll use it for diagramming, or they'll use it for slides and so on. And that's a use case where I think we haven't spent as much time really optimizing or making better, but it's still something that's sort of in the general area of like stuff that we think people should use it for.
I mean, there's a lot of tools for that, and a lot of people have tried to improve PowerPoint and Keynote, and it's often a dead end.
Where it starts getting unusual, I think, is in some of the more esoteric kinds of use cases, right? And we talked about in these COVID times, like people wanting more connection, and so people will do things like you've probably seen this, but somebody created a model of San Francisco, and people are like starting to put buildings in there and say, hey, this is where I am, and so on. And so people are sort of collaborating in ways that bring a little bit of fun and joy and playfulness to their lives. You also see a little bit of that in sort of the brainstorming kind of use case, where you start with people just sort of moving sticky notes around, but eventually then you end up with sort of more playful ways of interacting with each other in that space, because it's sort of a more free-form kind of activity, right? Compared to, you're trying to nail down the design for something. So, I do think, I mentioned this before about the immediacy or sort of the physicality of people being in the same place. And I think that is, for me, probably the biggest kind of surprise is I thought literally when we did the multiplayer feature, we did it because we felt like we had to, because it was the only way that you could make sure that as people were looking at the document, that they wouldn't be two different versions of the document. So it was really more about the integrity of the information.
Sure.
But I think what we found is people are actually connecting with each other because of that feature in a way that I didn't expect.
Right. Just like hanging out in Figma or something.
Yeah.
Really cool. And maybe to touch on that, just the raw number of people that are using this product, and of course, not asking to disclose that, but congrats on raising another round, another cash infusion, somewhat recently in a time where, it's difficult for a lot of products or a lot of startups to do that. What's kind of next for the company? Is it on the path to public kind of thing, or is this just another infusion to add features and add users and just keep it going?
Yeah, I don't think I'm, going to get into that.
Right.
But the way that I think about it is, I'll start personal, but then we'll go to the company in a second.
Sure.
So the way I think about work is, I kind of don't want to work on something unless it's going to be personally fun or rewarding for me.
Sure.
And I've turned down jobs that would have been more like bigger titles or more lucrative or whatever in order to work on things that I personally gravitate towards. And I think the company is full of people like that. So we're all at Figma because we like working on this thing.
That's awesome.
And what's really nice is sometimes you find the thing you want to work on, but you don't find the market fit, or you don't find the revenue or whatever. Like I was at Medium before. Medium's a great product.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, great.
It's a
product.
great company, but it's a really tough space. It's hard to make money in publishing, right? So with Figma, like I feel like we've got this like magic combination of a company full of people who love working on this thing, and it happens to be doing pretty well in the market. And so, we're going to keep that going, as long as we can. And, the good news is I think there's plenty of headroom in just the product that we have now, in that if you look at what people in the broader world outside of Silicon Valley and so on are using for design, people are still using all sorts of things, right? People are still using Photoshop to design websites, for example. So there's just a lot of headroom there for us to just keep doing what we're doing and grow as a business. And then there's a bunch of adjacent things that we'd like to explore at some point. And so, who's to say, exactly which direction and when, but I feel like there's a lot of different ways we can go there.
Awesome. And just to close, can you share anything about any new features that are coming out in Figma? Can you tease anything out?
Sure. One of the biggest requests right now is we have a feature called auto layout, which is, it's sort of like having a Flexbox inside of your design. Mm-hmm. And for those listeners who know what Flexbox is. And we purposefully limited the set of properties that thing could have because we didn't want to make it too complex. But I think what we're finding is that it's not quite enough for people to be able to do all the layouts they want to be able to do. And so we're adding more flexibility there. And then in doing that, we're really trying to make sure that we're rethinking how the UI works in such a way that it doesn't get overly complex. And so, we've actually done like 3 or 4 or 5 different iterations of this UI now just to try to get it right. But that's one I'm pretty excited about. And then we also are working on something around states. And with states, we're also doing this thing where we're really trying to rethink like, okay, why do people really want this? And what can we do with it? And how can we make it really fit in with Figma? And so we're maybe taking a little bit more time with that one than we might if we're just doing it in a more straightforward way. But we're trying to make it really flexible and really feel like Figma.
Cool. Really cool. Well, Sho, that's all I have. Thanks so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. It was fun.
This podcast is a production of the All Turtles Worldwide Media Empire. We recorded this episode at the rainy Union Street studio in San Francisco, California. Thanks to Sho for joining us this episode. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, send us an email to hello@all-turtles.com. Marie reads every message. Thanks to everyone who made this episode possible, including Jim Metzendorf for editing, Marie McCoy-Thompson for producing, Chris Plug for his audio expertise, Micah Rivera for our artwork, and Matt Ammerman for our theme music. On behalf of Jessica Collier, Phil Libin, and yours truly, John Cifuentes, And the rest of the All Turtles team, thanks for listening.